Uh, Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to this year's Lyceum Project Young Scholar Session. My name is Yannis Perperidis. I am currently a research fellow of in AI ethics at the Center for Hellenic Studies of the Harvard University, and I have the pleasure of serving as this year's host for this session. It is a great honor for me to host this particular session because I genuinely support the idea of dedicating a space to scholars at the early stages of their careers, a space where they can present fresh ideas that may ultimately have an enormous impact on their fields. By institutionalizing this session, the Lyceum Project acknowledges something very important, that the next generation of thinkers and researchers is not simply the future of scholarship, but an indispensable part of its present. I also think that this session carries a particularly timely message. In many parts of the world, as I'm sure you know, and of course in our country, research continues to face serious challenges, including underfunding and the persistent phenomenon of the so-called brain drain. Yet despite these difficulties, the next generation of scholars continues to find ways forward. Through hard work, determination, and intellectual curiosity, young researchers manage to remain at the forefront of research and innovation. To me, this is precisely what the Young Scholars session of the Lyceum Project reflects, and it is extremely important that this conference has established it as a distinct session within its program. Judging from the quality and originality of the abstracts submitted by the 4 young scholars we have with us today, I can say that with confidence that they could present their work at any conference. Yet they chose to participate in this particular session because it is not simply another conference panel where an interesting discussion takes place and ends there. Rather, it is a session that explicitly states that the next generation of researchers deserves to have a voice and a seat at the table, thereby recognizing and validating their efforts, often in the face of the aforementioned adverse circumstances. So, as someone who is, technically speaking, still a young scholar, I would like to thank the committee of the Lyceum Project for conceiving and sustaining this initiative. Now, in a more practical manner, let me briefly outline the format of the session. Each presenter will be given 20 to 25 minutes for their presentation. And once all 4 presentations have concluded, we will have an additionally 25 or 30 minutes for an extended discussion in the form of a panel, drawing on questions from both the audience and myself, maybe. I would kindly ask everyone, the 4 young scholars, to help us stay on time so that we can make the most of the discussion at the end. So thank you again for being here this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy this year's Lyceum Project Young Scholar Session. I would like to invite our first presenter, Andreas Athanasakis, who is an adjunct lecturer at the School of Applied Mathematical and Physical Sciences of the National Technical University of Athens. He will talk about safeguarding the moral agency for future generations. Please, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. It's a great opportunity. So first, when we talk about the ethics of AI, the conversation usually begins with a familiar set of questions. Is the system accurate? Is it fair? Is it transparent? Is it biased? Is it safe? Can it be aligned with human values? These are serious and necessary questions, but today I want to suggest that they do not yet reach the deepest level of the problem. The deeper ethical question is not only whether AI systems produce good or bad outcomes, it is whether as AI becomes woven into the infrastructure of social life, we are quietly altering the very conditions under which human beings learn how to judge, how to deliberate, how to inherit traditions, and how to act as moral agents. In other words, the ethical challenge is not only about what AI does for us, it is also about what AI gradually teaches us to become. My central claim is simple. AI does not merely automate tasks, it reorganizes the environments in which human beings learn what matters, what counts as evidence, and what forms of action seem possible, reasonable, or desirable. And for that reason, the key ethical task before us is not only to align AI with present values, but to safeguard the moral agency of future generations as AI becomes an infrastructural mediator of everyday life. And this is where Aristotle becomes useful. For Aristotle, ethics is not only fundamentally a matter of applying a code. Morality is not in the first instance rule compliance. It is the cultivation of phronesis, or practical wisdom, the learned ability to discern what is fitting, good, and proportionate in particular circumstances. One does not acquire practical wisdom merely by memorizing principles. One acquires it through repeated practice, through guidance, through habituation, through emotional formation, through life with the others, and through the slow education of attention. This point matters enormously for AI ethics. If practical wisdom is something cultivated through lived engagement, then the danger of AI is not only that it may generate biased decisions. The danger is also that by outsourcing more and more the selection, prediction, judgment, and interpretation to machine systems, we may weaken the very practices through which human beings become capable of good judgment in the first place. This is what we call as the risk of moral deskilling. Today, I want to make that risk concrete through three mechanisms. The first is attention-shaping architectures. The second is epistemic mediation. The third is environmental displacement. And I will close by showing why these dynamics are also political, why they distribute power unevenly, amplify inequality, and constrain who actually gets to exercise agency. Let's talk about attention-shaping architectures. This phrase refers to systems of recommendation, nudging, ranking, and scoring that do not merely present information neutrally, but actively organize the field of salience within which human deliberation takes place. Recommendation systems tell us what to watch next, what to read next, whom to follow next, what to buy next. Nudges make one option easier, more visible, or more attractive than another. Scores and rankings classify persons, behaviors, and risks according to pre-designed metrics. Now, this may sound familiar or even harmless. After all, human life has always involved advice, persuasion, and prioritization. Every society has forms of guidance. So what is new here? What is new is the scale, speed, and opacity with which machine systems can now intervene in the ecology of attention. They do so continuously, adaptively, and often invisibly. They do not merely offer content, they shape the rhymes of perception. And this matters because deliberation depends on attention. If I cannot attend well, I cannot deliberate well. If my field of attention is narrowed, accelerated, emotionally manipulated, or pre-sorted according to what maximizes engagement, then my moral judgment is already being conditioned before I consciously decide anything at all. Let me offer a simple example: a workplace productivity dashboard. The employee's performance is qualified through metrics: response time, task completion, customer scores, behavioral indicators. The manager, seeking fairness and efficiency, consults the dashboard. The employee, knowing the metrics, starts optimizing behavior for what is measurable. Soon, both manager and worker begin to interpret work through the categories provided by the system. The issue is not merely that the numbers may be inaccurate. The issue is that the score begins to colonize practical reason. The question is no longer what is good work in this situation, but what improves the score. A metric designed as an aid to judgment becomes a substitute for judgment. We can see the same example in education. Suppose a school uses AI systems to identify students at risk. The intention may be supportive, but once a risk score enters the room, teachers may begin, often unconsciously, to see some students through the category the system has assigned. Expectations shift, attention shifts, resources shift. A predictive system begins helping create the very future it claims only to foresee. This is the ethical problem in its full depth. Attention-shaping systems do not merely help us navigate complexity. They can also reduce the space in which practical wisdom develops. They make some things hyper-visible and others invisible. They compress hesitation, they reward speed over reflection, reaction over discernment, optimization over judgment. And if that becomes our ordinary moral environment, then we should not be surprised if people become less practiced at dwelling with ambiguity, less willing to endure uncertainty, and less able to deliberate patiently with others. From an Aristotelian standpoint, this is not a minor technical side effect. It is a deformation of ethical formation itself. And let me turn now to the second mechanism, epistemic mediation. If the first mechanism concerns attention, the second concerns knowledge. By epistemic mediation, I mean the growing role of AI in standing between communities and the processes by which they know, remember, interpret, and dispute what is true, valuable, or authoritative. This includes synthetic texts, synthetic images, summaries, generated explanations, chatbot responses, automated paraphrases, and machine-produced representations of history, culture, and tradition. At first glance, this seems immensely beneficial. AI can make knowledge more accessible. It can summarize complex texts, translate difficult material, generate educational aids, and widen access to cultural archives. All of this is real and important. But the ethical issue lies deeper than access. The question is not only whether communities can retrieve information more quickly. The question is what happens when AI becomes a primary mediator of inherited wisdom. When it increasingly shapes how people receive, imagine, and contest the traditions that form them. Here the phrase ancestral wisdom is important. I do not use it romantically. I do not mean that whatever comes from the past is automatically wise. I mean the accumulated practices, stories, rituals, habits, texts, symbols, and interpretive disciplines through which communities hand down ways of orienting themselves in the world. Such inheritances are not reducible to data. They are not merely repositories of content. They are forms of life. They are embodied and dialogical. They are learned in practice, in argument, in commentary, in imitation, in correction, in living memory. Now consider what happens when synthetic text begins to mediate that inheritance. Suppose a student asks an AI system, "What did ancient philosophy teach us about the good life?" The answer may be concise and helpful, but in being so, cleanly delivered, it may flatten disagreement, erase historical depth, compress competing traditions into a single smooth summary, and conceal the fact that interpretation itself is a site of struggle. The student receives an answer, but the student may not learn that traditions speak in many voices, that texts require apprenticeship, that wisdom often emerges through patient confrontation with difficulty. In such a case, the issue is not simply factual error. The issue is that AI can encourage a relation to knowledge in which understanding is severed from practices of interpretation that once sustained it. Synthetic images intensify this problem further. An AI-generated image of an ancient ritual, a vanished city, or a traditional community may appear vivid and persuasive, but vividness is not the same as truth. A generated image can silently impose a single visual imagination of the past, making speculation look like authenticity. It can aestheticize memory. It can stabilize one imaginary version of tradition as though that were simply what it looked like. This matters because memory is not only factual, it is political, interpretive, and communal. Communities struggle over how they remember themselves. AI systems can enter that struggle while appealing neutral. So here again, we see the deeper ethical issue. The danger is not merely misinformation. It is the reorganization of epistemic life, the relocation of interpretive authority from living communities, practices, and traditions towards machine systems that are optimized for fluency, legibility, and immediacy. And once that happens, the challenge is not just that people might know the wrong thing. It is that they may cease to learn what it means to know responsibly at all. The third mechanism is environmental displacement, and I think it's one of the most often neglected in philosophical discussions of AI. When many people encounter AI, it appears almost immaterial. One types a prompt, and the result appears. The process feels frictionless, nearly magical. The interface is clean, the labor is hidden, the resource use is invisible, but this convenience is deceptive. Every apparently seamless AI interaction depends on vast material infrastructures, data centers, energy systems, cooling systems, hardware supply chains, mined materials, global logistics, maintenance, and often forms of precarious or hidden labor. Convenience at the level of the interface frequently rests on extraction elsewhere. This is what I mean by environmental displacement. Costs do not disappear, they are moved. They are displaced from the site of use to sites of production, energy consumption, resource extraction, labor burden, and ecological strain. The language of optimization often obscures this. We are told that systems are being optimized for efficiency, convenience, personalization, speed, or scale, but we should always ask, efficient for whom? Convenient for whom? At whose expense? And on what material basis? Take a very ordinary example. A user asks a generative system to produce 10 versions of a text, 20 variations of an image, or endless revisions of a plan. At the level of user experience, this feels almost weightless. But the norm being created is one of the limitless, on-demand generation. And that norm is sustained by energy-intensive infrastructures that are anything but weightless. Or consider the labor that often remains invisible. Behind automated systems, there are human beings labeling data, cleaning datasets, moderating disturbing content, correcting outputs, maintaining systems, and performing digital piecework that enables the polished appearance of machine autonomy. The user receives convenience, another worker absorbs fatigue, precarity, or psychological cost. Now, why does this matter for moral philosophy, rather than simply for environmental policy or labor studies? Because human flourishing depends on the animate conditions that sustain life. Human beings do not become wise, free, and responsible in abstraction from ecology. They require breathable air, livable environments, sustainable rhymes, non-exploitative labor conditions, and forms of embodied contact with the living world. To damage those conditions is not merely to create an external environmental problem. It is to undermine the material and ecological basis upon which moral life itself depends. This point is especially important because AI discourse often imagines intelligence as though it could be separated from embodiment and ecology. But no intelligence is disembodied in practice. AI too has a footprint. It depends on land, water, minerals, electricity, cables, servers, labor, and institutions. It is infrastructural all the way down. So if convenience becomes our supreme norm, and if optimization for frictionless experience intensifies extractive pressure on energy, labor, and ecosystems, then the cost is not merely out there. It returns to human life by weakening the animate conditions in which flourishing becomes possible. A civilization cannot outsource its ecological and labor costs independently and still imagine that it is preserving the ethical conditions of freedom. At this point, we can return to the final claim that these three dynamics distribute power unevenly, amplify inequality, and constrain who gets to exercise agency. This is crucial because none of the mechanisms I have described affects all persons equally. Not everyone designs the architecture of attention. Not everyone controls the datasets, the metrics, the scoring criteria, or the recommendation engines. Not everyone can contest an algorithmic classification. Not everyone can opt out of automation in education, hiring, policing, credit, welfare, or medicine. Not everyone bears the environmental cost of infrastructure equally. And not everyone has the same capacity to supplement machine mediation with time, education, institutional power, or human expertise. That means AI is never simply a neutral layer added evenly on top of society. It enters pre-existing social worlds marked by inequality, and it often deepens those inequalities. And that has direct consequences for agency. When attention is continuously managed, when inherited knowledge is increasingly pre-processed, and when the ecological basis of life is displaced and strained, agency becomes unevenly distributed. Some people retain the practical ability to judge and refuse. Others are left with increasingly constrained forms of compliance dressed up as a choice. That's why this discussion belongs not only to ethics in the narrow sense, but also to political philosophy, social theory, and ecological thought. The future of moral agency is inseparable from the distribution of technological power. Let me close by putting the argument as plainly as possible. AI is not only changing what we do, it is changing how we attend, how we know, and under what material conditions we live. Through attention-shaping architectures, it reorganizes the field within which judgment begins. Through epistemic mediation, it reshapes the transmission and contestation of inherited wisdom. Through environmental displacement, it moves the cost of convenience onto energy systems, laboring bodies, and ecosystems, weakening the animate conditions that sustain human flourishing. These are not separate issues. They are intertwined. Together, they help determine whether a future person will still possess the practical capacities required for moral agency. So the ultimate measure of success in AI ethics cannot be only whether systems become more capable, more efficient, or even more aligned. The deeper measure is whether the worlds we are building still allow human beings to become wise, responsible, and free. The task before us is therefore not simply to build smarter machines. It is to ensure that in building them, we do not erode the human ecological conditions that make moral life possible. Thank you.